So I'm Tope, I'm one of the policy officers from the GLA, and I work closely on community-led housing. So the main purpose of my presentation this morning is essentially to give you a bit of information about the work that the Mayor of London is doing in terms of supporting the community-led housing sector in London. So first of all, I'll give you a bit of background in terms of the housing context in London, and then we'll take a view on how community-led housing is shaping up in London, and then touch upon the barriers that we've seen in terms of developing the sector, and the three key things that the Mayor is focusing on in order to make sure that the sector grows. So this is Sadiq Khan. And I think what has been really important is that Londoners have said that after Brexit, which is a word that we can't avoid, and policing and crime, housing is of most concern to Londoners. So he has secured funding from national government, about 4.8 billion to deliver affordable housing, approximately 116,000 by March 2022. So there's a lot to do. And this graph just gives you a brief overview in terms of London's population, and particularly London's workforce, has grown far faster than the number of homes that we're building. So there is like a historic shortfall. So in terms of housing targets, we have been really ambitious in terms of how many homes that we need to deliver. So, the Mayor's vision and objectives, so he has set out in his London housing strategy that essentially London needs in full, particularly genuinely affordable homes, so that we can ensure that everyone thrives, social benefits, economic benefits. Housing is key. And particularly drawing on point number 3, which is high quality homes and inclusive neighbourhoods, which is where community-led housing comes in. So who is building London's homes? So essentially, this graph shows here the blue area that essentially the private sector is developing most of London's homes, and they have dominated the sector. But the GLA now is focusing on how we can diversify that. And one way of doing that is by involving communities and getting communities to develop and build homes themselves. So private developers do have a key role, but we also want to make sure that communities can build their own homes and live in their own homes and have long-term benefits as well. So diversification is very important. So I refer a lot to community-led housing, and some of you might be thinking, what is that? So community-led housing essentially doesn't have a statutory definition, but the sector has come together to kind of say that we agree to 3 common principles of what it will be. So the first principle is meaningful community engagement and consent, and I think the 2 main words there are meaningful and consent. So the community must be involved in a meaningful way and also consent to decisions that are taken in terms of the development of the scheme. The second point is the community group should own, manage or steward the homes in a manner of their choosing. So there is a role that they play in terms of that. And lastly, the benefit of the scheme should be in perpetuity. So there should be a long-term benefit to the community in terms of these homes developed. So there's different models that we've seen in London in terms of how community-led housing has been delivered. And one that we refer to a lot is the Older Women's Co-Housing Scheme, which Maria Brenton is here and will definitely give a good overview tomorrow in terms of the development of that scheme and how it's kind of set a real good example in terms of co-housing in London. There's also London Community Land Trust and RUS that are both CLTs, and they deliver affordable housing and make sure that the homes remain affordable in perpetuity. And then you also have cooperatives and essentially communities come together to form a model that they feel will work best for their situation. So referring back to this top-down policy, so the Mayor has kind of set a target. So he set himself a target, and this is following a lot of pressure from community groups themselves. So he has set this target to identify a pipeline of community-led housing schemes by 2021, and this is with capacity to deliver at least 1,000 homes. So that has been set out in our London housing strategy, and that is essentially how the mayor has shown that he is supporting this type of delivery. He's also put funding into the community-led housing hub, which I will touch upon briefly, and also lobbied national government in terms of community funding. So finance is very important. So the barriers and challenges that we've seen in terms of developing the sector is that access to advice, in terms of community groups obtaining advice, is limited, or was limited. Access to finance, investment as well is a barrier, and access to land. Community groups being able to compete with large developers was often a struggle, and we found that, it wasn't possible for them to compete with the large developers, large housing associations in terms of securing land to develop homes. So since joining the team about a year ago, the London Housing Strategy has set out clearly that target, that objective, and also the development of the community-led housing hub has been able to provide support to community groups directly. And the Community Housing Fund has now been launched and is available. So I will touch on these things a bit more in terms of saying how we've been able to use these approaches to overcome the challenges and barriers that we've seen. So the Community-Led Housing Hub, the hub was launched in 2017, and it's managed by people. So it's not just like a digital platform. There are people that work there. And essentially, it was launched and supported by the Mayor of London with funding, and also by local authorities to support community groups. So it's for the people and by the people. And what the hub do is they provide advice, support, expertise to community groups directly. So they will engage with community groups who have decided that they want to come together to build a scheme, or to think about how they can build a scheme. Because what you will often find is that community groups are led by volunteers or those that aren't, familiar with the housing process. So they do need that support in terms of early discussions and how the scheme will be, what the scheme should look like, how will it be modelled, what finance and investment is required. So the hub are there to provide this advice directly to community groups. And we found that with this being available, community groups can approach the hub in a way that probably wasn't available before. They could go to this platform and discuss, I've got an idea, or this community group has got an idea. How can we go about doing it? The hub also provide early on feasibility funding. So this is to support things such as business planning, to support things such as becoming an incorporated group, which are all things that are very important when you're considering starting a scheme. The London Community Housing Fund. So in January 2019, so earlier this year, the Mayor launched the London Community Housing Fund, and this makes available 38 million to support the sector in developing new homes. So 30 million of that is capital funding, 8 million of that is revenue funding, and the target is to deliver 500 homes by April 2023. Breaking down into how the fund works, so we found that revenue funding is really essential for this sector. Funding to go towards things like I mentioned earlier, feasibility funding, funding to support maybe hiring a project manager, in doing design studies, feasibility studies, planning applications, supporting planning applications. Revenue funding is really essential for that, and so the fund makes that available so that groups are able to use that funding to essentially kickstart the scheme. Capital funding is also available in terms of grant, and we've also made it available in terms of development finance. So groups are able to apply for loans to support their scheme. And I think one of the important things that we heard in terms of when we're developing this program is that community groups are thinking about the long term of the sector. They're thinking about how will there still be investment, or what sources of investment will be available in the long term. So having a revolving loan fund whereby schemes pay back into the pot of funding once they've delivered kind of helps to ensure that the sector is thought about in the future, and there is some finance available to other groups who want to develop homes in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. Access to land, which is another barrier that we identified, is that community groups often find it difficult, as I mentioned, to compete with the large developers, the large private developers who are securing large pieces of land to develop a large number of homes. So what the mayor did is launched a small site, small builders program. And essentially, that makes available to community groups small plots of publicly owned land that can be developed on. What is kind of a good requirement of the scheme is that the legal contracts and the bidding process is standardized so that community groups are able to approach this in a way that is easier, so that it isn't difficult in terms of having to go through huge bidding processes, huge kind of legal contracts, and going through various loopholes and jumping various hoops. This program has essentially been able to offer community groups the chance to bid for pieces of land that they can develop on. They can develop units between about 10 to 30 on these pieces of land, making it easier for them to get access to land, essentially. And this is on publicly owned land. So Transport for London put forward 10 sites, and 2 of them were specifically allocated to community land trusts. And London Community Land Trust were the successful bidders of the 2 allocated sites, which means that on these 2 sites, 100% genuinely affordable homes will be delivered on these pieces of publicly owned land. So in summary, essentially, London is doing everything we can to support the growth of the community-led housing sector. We want to ensure that there is investment available, which is why we have the Community Housing Fund. And we also want to ensure that community groups are able to approach are able to access advice and expertise in terms of coming up with the ideas of how they want their scheme to work, and making sure that they're well-resourced and have access to finance in order to do this. We're really excited with what's happening in London. I think this has really shown that political buy-in is important. So from top down, it is really important to have the support of local authorities, but also from the bottom up, it's really important for them to hold local authorities to account as well. So I refer to London Community Land Trust, who are part of Citizens UK, and they have done an excellent job in terms of holding the mayor to account and making sure that he delivers on the commitments he works on. So there is a balance to be struck in terms of top down and bottom up. It's really important that this comes together and there's a balance there. Also, just to mention briefly, I think in terms of how we take this forward, it's really important that local authorities are involved, community groups are kind of are happy or are aware that this is available to them, and also making sure that this is something that's not just in the present, in the moment, but something that we're working towards to make sure that it's sustainable, to make sure that this provides housing in the long term that is sustainable and that is increases the number of homes that we develop that are providing social benefits, economic benefits, health benefits to those that live in them. So I look forward to the panel discussion later on. Thank you.